The gavel hadn't even come down yet, and my father was already smiling at me like he'd won. "You're wrong, my foolish daughter," he said loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. People laughed, actual laughter in a courtroom at my expense. His lawyer leaned back in his chair like the case was already closed, and I sat there alone, no family beside me, no friends, not a single person from my unit, just me, a folding chair, and a plain brown accordion file resting on my knees like it was nothing at all. They had no idea what was inside it. 2 years ago I bought a house. My house. Every dollar of it came from 18 years of service, careful investing, and a discipline I'd built one deployment at a time. I didn't borrow a cent from my father. I didn't touch an inheritance. I didn't ask permission because I'd learned a long time ago that asking my father for anything came with a price tag attached, usually paid in pride. I remember the day I got the keys. I stood in the empty living room sunlight cutting across the hardwood floors, and I let myself cry for the first time in years. Not because it was a mansion, it wasn't. It was a modest 3-bedroom colonial with a crooked mailbox and a garden that needed love. But it was mine. Earned. Clean. I called my father that night mostly out of habit and told him about it. He was quiet for a second too long, then said, "Well, don't expect me to help you fix it up." Classic Richard Sanders. Even good news from me had to be met with a warning label. For a while that was that. He never visited. Never asked about the neighborhood or the mortgage or whether I was happy. My father has never once in 18 years asked me what I actually do in the army. Not my rank, not my job, nothing. To him I was just off playing soldier, a phrase he used at Thanksgiving dinners like it was a punchline. Then the market shifted. Home values in my area jumped almost 40% in 18 months, and that's when my father suddenly remembered he had a daughter worth paying attention to. It started small, a phone call asking about the property taxes, then a visit unannounced where he walked through my house measuring rooms with his eyes like an appraiser. Then the sentence that still makes my stomach turn when I replay it. "This is a family house. Everything I built, you built on top of. So really it belongs to all of us." I laughed the first time he said it. I actually thought he was joking. He wasn't. 3 weeks later, I came home from a training rotation to find the locks changed. My key didn't work. There were boxes in my garage that weren't mine. His recliner sitting in my living room like a flag planted on foreign soil. I stood on my own porch in my own driveway staring at a house I had paid for entirely on my own, locked out like a stranger. When I called him, his voice was calm, almost bored. "You'll thank me one day. I'm just protecting what's ours." Ours. As if he'd swung a single hammer, as if he'd signed a single document, as if he'd spent even one night lying awake calculating interest rates while stationed somewhere with spotty internet and worse coffee. I gave him 30 days to leave voluntarily. He didn't. Instead, he hired Victor Hale, a lawyer with a reputation for turning simple disputes into theater, and filed a claim against me. Against his own daughter, claiming ownership of a house he never paid a dime toward, built on nothing but blood relation and audacity. That's how I ended up here in this courtroom listening to my own father mock me in front of strangers. I won't lie, for one moment sitting there I felt 16 years old again. Small, overlooked. The daughter who came second to his business, second to his image, second to everything except the version of me he could control. But then I looked down at the folder in my lap. 18 years of discipline sat inside it. Bank records, deployment orders, every wire transfer, every closing document, every piece of paper that told the true story of who built this life brick by brick, deployment by deployment, without his help and without his permission. Richard Sanders raised his eyebrows at me from across the room, still wearing that smug, satisfied smile, the one that used to make me shrink. It didn't shrink me anymore. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than hurt. I felt calm, steady, certain. "Dad," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, "today you'll finally learn who I really am." He didn't hear me. He was too busy laughing with his lawyer. He wouldn't be laughing for long. The judge called the case to order, and Richard Sanders stood up like a man about to give the performance of his life. In a way, he was. "Your Honor." He began voice warm, practiced the same tone he used on clients when he wanted them to sign a contract without reading it too closely. I raised this woman with my own 2 hands. I put a roof over her head for 18 years before she ever put on that uniform. I sat with my hands folded on the table watching him work the room the way he used to work every room he ever walked into. My father has always been a builder, not just of houses but of narratives. He knows how to lay a foundation of sympathy and stack the walls of a story until it looks like truth from the outside, even when the frame underneath is hollow. I paid for her education, he continued. I helped with repairs on that house more times than I can count. I was there for her mother day and night while our daughter was stationed, who knows where doing who knows what. I felt my jaw tighten at that. Who knows what? As if my entire career was some vague rumor he'd heard secondhand. Victor Hale rose beside him, buttoning his jacket with the slow confidence of a man who already believed he'd won. Your Honor, we have testimony. We have character witnesses. We have a lifetime of parental sacrifice on record. What we don't have, he said, turning slightly toward me without quite looking at me, is any real understanding from my client's daughter of the legal or financial realities involved here. She's spent her adult life in the military. With respect. That doesn't exactly prepare a person for matters like home equity contractor liens or family estate law. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the gallery. I could feel it the way people's postures shifted slightly toward him, the way a woman in the second row nodded along like she was watching a movie and rooting for the right side to win. She's just a soldier, Victor added almost gently, as if he were being kind to me by saying it. A good one, I'm sure, but this is a courtroom, not a battlefield. I wrote that down, word for word. Not because it hurt, though it did in a small old familiar place, but because I wanted to remember exactly how they underestimated me. People often mistake my silence for agreement. It never has been. It's strategy. My father took the stand next, and Victor walked him through a story so polished it could have been rehearsed in a mirror. He talked about driving me to school. He talked about paying my braces off dollar by dollar. He talked about sitting beside my mother's hospital bed during her final months alone. He said, completely alone. While I was, his words, off somewhere overseas. That part cut deeper than I expected, because it wasn't entirely a lie. I had missed some of those final months. I carry that. I will always carry that. But what he left out conveniently was that I had been denied emergency leave twice, due to an active deployment freeze that I had called every single day, that I had wired money home for her care, even while my father was busy expanding his construction business into a 3rd county. He didn't mention that. He didn't mention a lot of things. She barely visited, he said, voice cracking just slightly, just enough. And now she wants to lock me out of the one piece of this family I have left. A few people in the gallery actually wiped their eyes. My own father performing grief like a man auditioning for sympathy while sitting 3 feet from the daughter he'd locked out of her own home. I didn't react. I kept my hands folded. I kept my breathing, even a discipline drilled into me long before any courtroom and briefing rooms, in situations far more dangerous than this one where the wrong expression at the wrong moment could cost more than a case. The judge, Eleanor Brooks, listened closely, her expression unreadable, occasionally jotting something down. She hadn't ruled on anything yet, but I could see in the set of her mouth that the story my father had built was for now standing. Victor turned to address the room one final time before the recess. Your Honor, at this point, I think it's fairly clear where this is heading. This is a simple case of a daughter financially inexperienced, emotionally distant, attempting to seize sole ownership of a family asset her father helped build. He smiled at me, the same smile my father wore when he thought he'd already won an argument before it started. This case, he said, folding his hands satisfied, is already over. I looked down at the folder in front of me, still closed, still waiting. They thought they knew my whole story because they knew the uniform, the deployments, the silence at family dinners. They thought a folder full of paper couldn't compete with a father's tears and a lawyer's charm. They had absolutely no idea what I had been building quietly for years, not out of anger but out of necessity. Judge Brooks called for a short recess. As the room shuffled and murmured, my father looked at me once more, that same smug certainty in his eyes. He still thought he knew who I was. He was about to learn otherwise. During the recess, I sat alone in the hallway outside the courtroom, my folder resting on my knees, and I let my mind drift back through 18 years my father never bothered to ask about. Not once, not one single time in nearly 2 decades did Richard Sanders ask me what I actually did in the Army. He never asked my rank, never asked where I was stationed, what my responsibilities were, whether I was safe or challenged or proud of the work I did. To him, I enlisted, I disappeared into a green uniform, and I came home occasionally like a guest passing through his life, rather than a daughter living her own. "She's off playing soldier," he used to say at family gatherings, always with that same dismissive little laugh, the kind that made distant cousins chuckle politely without understanding what they were laughing at. He said it so often that I think he genuinely believed it. In his mind, I was still the 18-year-old who left for basic training, frozen in time, never allowed to grow into anything more complicated than his assumption. He never knew that by 29 I was managing logistics contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He never knew I sat across tables from defense contractors twice my age, negotiating terms, catching discrepancies in fine print that would have cost the government millions if left unnoticed. He never knew I had spent 2 years investigating procurement fraud on a base reconstruction project, testifying in front of officials whose decisions affected thousands of soldiers' lives. He never knew that logistics meant I had to understand contract law, real estate law, federal acquisition regulations, and financial auditing well enough to catch professionals trying to slip falsified numbers past me. He thought I was a soldier. I was that too. But I was also by necessity in training something closer to an investigator, a negotiator, a translator between military operations and legal accountability. None of that mattered to him because he never asked. After my mother passed, something in me shifted. I don't know if it was grief or clarity, but for the first time, I understood how quickly a life could be rewritten by people who claimed to love you. I watched quietly as my father began describing our family history in ways that didn't quite match what I remembered. Small exaggerations at first, then larger ones. He'd tell people he financed my education in full, when in truth I'd paid most of it myself through service commitments and loans I worked overtime to close out early. He'd tell people he helped extensively with the house, when in truth his only contribution had been one afternoon spent complaining about the paint color. I didn't correct him at family gatherings. I've never been someone who needs to win an argument out loud. But I started without any dramatic decision, simply keeping things. Not out of suspicion exactly, not yet, but out of habit, built from years of protecting facts in professional environments where memory alone was never enough. Every email between us I saved. Every wire transfer for the house closing documented and labeled. Every receipt for repairs I paid a licensed contractor to complete because my father's idea of a repair was duct tape and confidence filed neatly by date. Every bank statement showing the mortgage paid entirely from my own income. Every deployment order proving exactly where I was stationed and when cross-referenced against the exact dates he claimed I was never around. I wasn't building a case, not then. I was simply doing what any trained officer does, instinctively protecting the truth in a form that couldn't be reshaped by someone else's convenient memory. It's strange sitting in that hallway realizing how much of my adult life had quietly prepared me for this exact moment, without my ever intending it to. Every contract I'd audited, every fraudulent invoice I'd caught buried in a stack of legitimate paperwork, every hour spent learning to read the small print that most people skip past because they trust the person handing them the document. My father taught me that trust was something you gave freely to family. The Army taught me that trust without verification is how people lose everything. I sat there running my thumb along the edge of the folder, and I thought about my mother. She used to tell me gently in the kitchen while I was home on leave, "Your father sees what he wants to see, sweetheart. Don't let that convince you it's the truth." I didn't fully understand what she meant back then. I understood it completely now. She never saw this day. She never saw the house, the courtroom, any of it. But I think she would have recognized this moment as inevitable, not out of bitterness, but out of a mother's quiet certainty that her daughter would eventually stop being underestimated. When the bailiff called us back into the courtroom, I stood, smoothed my jacket, and picked up the folder. It felt heavier now, though nothing inside it had changed. Only my understanding of what it represented had. Not a stack of documents. A record of a life my father never once bothered to notice. I walked back into that courtroom, sat down, and placed the folder on the table in front of me, squared perfectly with the edge the way I'd been trained to present any critical document, clean, ordered, undeniable. Richard glanced at it briefly, then looked away unimpressed, the same way he always had. He still thought it was just paper. Judge Brooks called the room back to order, and I stood before my seat had even fully settled. "Your Honor." I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "Permission to submit evidence." She looked at me for a moment, not dismissively, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned over many years on the bench that quiet people often carry the loudest truths. "Permission granted, Lieutenant Colonel Sanders." I heard my father shift in his seat at the sound of my rank spoken aloud in that room, but I didn't look at him. I opened the folder. The first section was labeled simply Purchase and Ownership. I laid out the original closing documents for the house, each page initialed, each signature mine alone. The mortgage approval letter listing my income exclusively verified through military pay records. The wire transfer confirmation for the down payment sent from an account that had never once in its history received a deposit from my father. Victor Hale leaned forward, studying the documents with the practiced skepticism of a man used to picking apart weaker evidence. But there was nothing to pick apart. Every number matched, every date lined up. I moved to the second section, Repairs and Improvements. Invoices from licensed contractors, each one paid in full from my personal account, spanning 2 years of renovations, a new roof, updated wiring, a rebuilt back porch. I placed beside them a stack of my father's own text messages, printed and dated, in which he'd complained about the cost of paint, rather than offered to help cover it. "Objection," Victor said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier polish. "Relevance, Your Honor." "Overruled," Judge Brooks said, simply, not even looking up from the page in her hand. "Continue, Colonel." The third section was the one I knew would matter most, timeline verification. Official military deployment orders, stamped and certified, showing precisely where I was stationed during the months my father claimed I was never around during my mother's illness. Records showing 2 formal requests for emergency leave, both denied due to an active deployment freeze, a freeze that existed on record, verifiable, indisputable. Bank statements showing wire transfers sent home for my mother's medical care during the exact weeks my father told the court I had abandoned the family. The room had gone very quiet. Even the low murmur of the gallery, the shifting of papers, the small coughs and creaks of a public courtroom, all of it had thinned into something close to silence. Richard was still smiling, but it had changed shape. It was thinner now, held in place by effort rather than confidence. I could hear him mutter to Victor low enough that he probably thought no one else could hear. "It's just paperwork. Anyone can print paperwork." But Judge Brooks had already moved past the invoices and bank records to the final section of my folder, the one I had waited to place in front of her until this exact moment. My official military personnel file, requested and certified weeks earlier, containing verified income history, confirmed deployment dates, and legal documentation of my property ownership, cross-referenced by federal record. She read slowly, carefully, turning each page with the same unhurried precision she'd used on every document before it, but something in her posture had shifted. She set her glasses down at one point, rubbed the bridge of her nose, then picked them back up and kept reading. I watched her eyes move across the deployment record, showing I had been stationed overseas during a joint reconstruction operation, exactly when my father claimed I was simply avoiding responsibility. I watched her cross-reference the dates against the leave denial forms. I watched her line up the mortgage document against the income verification, confirming beyond any possible dispute that not 1 cent of that house had come from Richard Sanders. She set the folder down. The pen slipped from her fingers and landed with a small, sharp click against the wooden bench. She looked up, not at me, at my father. "Sir," she said, and her voice had changed to quieter, but somehow it carried further than before. "Do you actually know who your daughter is?" The question hung in the air far longer than it should have for something so simple. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom, Richard Sanders had nothing to say. Victor shuffled the papers in front of him as though searching for an objection that didn't exist. The woman in the gallery who had nodded along with his story earlier now sat very still, her hand pressed lightly against her mouth. I didn't gloat. I didn't allow myself even the smallest flicker of satisfaction, because this had never been about proving I was smarter or stronger than my father. It had only ever been about the truth finally having somewhere to land. Judge Brooks straightened the folder in front of her, squared the edges the way I had, and looked back toward the man who had spent an entire morning describing himself as the architect of my success. "We'll take a short recess," she said. "When we return, Mr. Sanders, I have some questions for you." My father did not look at me as the bailiff called the room to order for the break. For the first time in longer than I could remember, he had absolutely nothing to say. When the courtroom reconvened, the energy in the room had shifted so completely that it almost felt like a different case entirely. Judge Brooks took her seat, folded her hands, and turned her full attention toward my father with the kind of focus that made even Victor Hale sit up straighter. "Mr. Sanders," she said, "I'd like you to walk me through the financial history of this property again. From the beginning." My father cleared his throat, adjusted his jacket, and began repeating the story he'd told earlier. The one about helping with the down payment, about covering repairs, about being a steady presence throughout the purchase and renovation. "You said earlier you contributed to the down payment," Judge Brooks said, glancing down at her notes. "Can you tell me the amount?" He hesitated. "Just slightly." "I don't recall the exact figure. It was some years ago. You also stated you paid for several repairs. Can you identify which ones?" Another pause, longer this time. "The roof primarily, and some electrical work." Judge Brooks lifted one of the documents from my folder, a printed set of texts I had submitted alongside the licensed contractor's invoice, and read a portion of it aloud, her voice flat and clinical. In it, my father complained about the cost of paint colors, and told me plainly that he wouldn't be contributing financially to any repairs. The gallery, which had laughed along with him just hours earlier, sat in uncomfortable silence. "Mr. Sanders," the judge continued, "this text was sent the same week the roof invoice was paid in full, yet you're testifying today that you covered that repair." Richard's jaw tightened. "I may be misremembering the specifics." "You may be," she said evenly. "Let's discuss the medical care your late wife received. You testified your daughter was, in your words, never around during that time." "That's true," he said, though, with noticeably less certainty than before. Judge Brooks held up the deployment orders, then the leave denial forms, then the wire transfer records showing funds sent home during the exact weeks in question. "According to these federal records, your daughter formally requested emergency leave twice during her mother's illness. Both requests were denied due to an active deployment freeze, a matter of record, not opinion. During that same period, wire transfers show funds sent from her account to cover medical expenses. Can you explain the discrepancy between your testimony and this documentation?" My father said nothing for a long moment. I watched something in him falter, not collapse exactly, but crack in a way I had never seen before. For as long as I'd known him, my father had never once admitted to being wrong about anything. Not about business decisions, not about people. Certainly never about me. "I didn't know about the leave denials," he finally said, quieter now. "You didn't ask," Judge Brooks replied simply. It wasn't cruel the way she said it. It was almost gentle in the way that only truth delivered without malice can be. "In 18 years, did you ever ask your daughter about her deployments, her responsibilities, her rank?" Silence. Victor tried to intervene. "Your Honor, with respect, my client's personal relationship with his daughter isn't the matter before this court. The property dispute is. On the contrary, Mr. Hale," Judge Brooks said without looking at him. Your client built an entire legal claim on the premise that he was a consistent, involved, financially supportive father. Every document submitted by the respondent directly contradicts that premise. That is very much the matter before this court. I sat quietly through all of it, my hands folded the same way they had been since the start of the hearing. I felt no satisfaction watching my father struggle through his own contradictions. If anything, I felt something closer to grief, the specific, complicated grief of watching a parent finally be seen clearly by everyone in the room except perhaps himself. Victor attempted one more line of questioning, trying to reframe the timeline, suggesting perhaps there had been miscommunication rather than deception. But every attempt ran straight into another document from my folder. Another date that didn't align, another gap between what my father claimed and what the record proved beyond dispute. At one point, Judge Brooks asked him directly, "Mr. Sanders, did you change the locks on your daughter's home without her knowledge or consent?" So. He didn't answer right away. "Yes," he finally said. "Did you do so believing you had legal or ownership rights to that property?" Another long pause. "I believed I had a right as her father." "That is not the same thing," Judge Brooks said, "and I think somewhere you know that." I glanced toward the back of the courtroom at one point and noticed an older man in a faded veteran's cap sitting quietly among the gallery, someone who had wandered in earlier during the recess, perhaps simply passing time in a public courthouse. He gave a small, slow nod, the kind one service member gives another without needing words. It wasn't for me specifically. It was for what the record had shown, for the discipline behind it, for the truth doing what it was supposed to do when finally given the chance. By the time Judge Brooks finished her questioning, my father was no longer sitting up straight. His shoulders had dropped. His voice, when he answered, had lost the performative warmth from earlier that morning. For the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom, Richard Sanders was not the man telling the story. He was simply a man being asked to account for one. Judge Brooks took a short recess to review the final documents, and when she returned to the bench, the courtroom felt different than it had all day. Quieter, steadier. The kind of quiet that settles in once everyone in the room already senses which way things are about to go. She looked out over the gallery first, then at Victor Hale, then at my father, and finally at me. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had spent decades weighing exactly these kinds of moments. "This case," she began, "was presented to this court as a dispute over family property and mutual contribution. Over the course of today's proceedings, however, the evidence has demonstrated something far more specific and far less ambiguous than that." She lifted the folder I had submitted, holding it lightly, almost respectfully. "The property in question was purchased entirely through the respondent's own income, verified through official military and banking records. All subsequent repairs and improvements were similarly funded solely by the respondent. The claimant's testimony regarding financial contribution involvement during a medical crisis and general caretaking has been directly contradicted by dated, verifiable documentation." My father sat very still, his hands folded tightly in his lap, staring at the table in front of him rather than at the judge. "Furthermore," she continued, "the claimant admitted under questioning to changing the locks on a property he does not legally own without the knowledge or consent of the rightful owner. This constitutes an unlawful attempt to assert control over property that was never his." She paused, letting the words settle into the room. "It is the ruling of this court that the property in its entirety belongs solely to Lieutenant Colonel Penelope Sanders. Mr. Richard Sanders is ordered to vacate the premises within 30 days. Given the extent of misrepresentation presented to this court today, Mr. Sanders will also be responsible for reasonable legal costs incurred by the respondent to the extent permitted under law. I am additionally referring elements of today's testimony for further review, given the apparent discrepancies between sworn statements and documented fact." Victor Hale sat frozen for a moment, then began quietly gathering papers he no longer had any use arguing over. He didn't look at my father. He didn't look at me either. I imagine in his line of work, losing gracefully was its own kind of skill, one he was clearly still practicing. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because so many people expect a moment like this to feel like fireworks, like some long-awaited explosion of vindication. It didn't. It felt heavier than that. Quieter. Like something that had been held taut for 18 years had finally carefully been allowed to release. My father turned toward me. For the first time all day, for the first time in longer than I could remember, he looked at me the way you look at someone you're actually seeing, rather than someone you've already decided you understand. "Penelope," he said. Not my foolish daughter. Not the dismissive nickname he used to file me under at every family gathering, every holiday, every conversation where my career came up only long enough to be waved away. Just my name. Plain and quiet, like he was saying it for the first time in years. I didn't respond right away. I let the moment exist without rushing to fill it because some silences deserve to be respected rather than resolved. "I didn't know," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. "About the leave denials, about the money you sent, any of it." "You didn't ask," I said, echoing the same words Judge Brooks had used earlier because they were true, and because I didn't have anything more dramatic to add. 18 years of silence between us couldn't be undone by one sentence in a courtroom, no matter how sincerely it was spoken. He nodded slowly, and for a moment I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since before my mother passed. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The delayed, uncomfortable recognition of a man realizing the daughter he thought he understood had built an entire life he'd never bothered to look at closely. It was too late for that recognition to change the outcome of the case. But I noticed watching him gather his things without his usual bravado, without Victor's confident hand on his shoulder, that something in him had shifted permanently. The version of himself he'd walked into that courtroom with certain dismissive, untouchable, had not walked back out with him. As the bailiff called the next case, and the room began to clear, I gathered my folder, closed it carefully, and stood. My father lingered near the door for a moment, as though he wanted to say something else, then thought better of it, and left quietly instead. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like I could finally breathe. A month passed before I truly felt settled back into the house. I moved slowly through those first few weeks, not because there was much to rebuild, but because I wanted to be deliberate about it. I repainted the hallway a soft, warm gray, the color my father had once complained about paying for, though, of course, he never had. I fixed the crooked mailbox out front finally after 2 years of meaning to. Small things, quiet things. The kind of maintenance that isn't about impressing anyone, just about caring for a life that belongs entirely to you. There was no celebration, no party, no toast, no triumphant phone calls to relatives who had doubted me. That was never who I was even before the courtroom, and it certainly wasn't who I intended to become after it. Revenge had never been the goal. I understood that clearly now, sitting in my quiet living room with a cup of coffee watching afternoon light move slowly across floors, I had refinished myself the summer before. One evening I took down an old photograph that had been sitting on a side table since before the court case even began, a picture of my father and me from years ago taken at some family barbecue. I barely remembered both of us squinting into the sun. I didn't throw it away. I simply moved it to a drawer gently, the way you set aside something you're not ready to look at every day, but aren't ready to discard either. In its place, I set a photograph of my mother on the mantel above the fireplace. She was laughing in it mid-sentence, caught in a moment of unguarded joy from a summer trip we'd taken together when I was home on leave. I hadn't looked at that photo in years. It felt right finally to give her that space in the house I had built without either of my parents' help, a house that, in its own quiet way, still carried pieces of both of them. A friend from my unit stopped by not long after, someone who'd heard through the grapevine what had happened and wanted to check in. She stood in my kitchen, looked around at the modest, sturdy home I'd fought so hard to keep, and said, only half joking, "Colonel Sanders, house owner extraordinaire." I laughed, actually laughed for what felt like the first time in months. Outside the base, I told her, I'm just Penelope. That distinction mattered more to me than I expected it to. For so long, my identity had been split into pieces. Other people assigned me soldier, to my father officer, to my command daughter, to no one in particular, since he'd never really taken the time to know what that meant. Standing in my own kitchen in my own home, I finally felt like all those pieces belonged to the same person. Not fragments, just me. About 3 weeks after the ruling, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Careful, slightly slanted, the same handwriting that used to sign report cards and birthday cards decades ago. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it slowly. It was an apology. Not a long one, and not without its awkward, imperfect phrasing, the kind of letter written by a man unaccustomed to admitting fault. He wrote that he hadn't understood what my life had actually become, that he regretted never asking, that he was sorry for the courtroom, for the locks, for 18 years of assumptions he'd never bothered to check. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases and set it in the drawer beside the old photograph rather than in the trash. Not because I had forgiven him, not yet, and maybe not for a long while still, but because some things deserve to be kept rather than erased, even the complicated ones, especially the complicated ones. Healing, I've learned, rarely arrives the way courtroom dramas suggest it should. Dramatic, immediate, wrapped up neatly the moment a judge reads a verdict. Real healing is slower than that. Quieter. It looks like repainting a hallway. It looks like choosing which photograph belongs on your mantle. It looks like folding a letter instead of tearing it apart and giving yourself permission to decide in your own time what comes next. What I really won that day wasn't a house, though I'm grateful every single morning that it's still mine. What I won was something harder to put into words, the simple, hard-earned freedom of no longer needing anyone else's permission to know exactly who I am. There are people who spend their whole lives trying to prove they deserve a place to call home. But the most valuable thing you can win isn't the house itself. It's the day you stop needing anyone else to tell you what you're worth. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where it found you. Drop a comment below and let me know what part stayed with you the longest. We share stories like this every single day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep walking through these stories together.